While most of us are tied up in domestic issues, keeping us well distracted, the U.S. assisted in the sinking of a Russian flagship known as the Moskva. Now, the U.S., of course, is trying to back off and say, look, we weren't directly involved, but even NBC News says the U.S. played a role in the sinking of the Russian Black Sea flagship. And Russia is basically already saying they are at war with NATO. A state propagandist said that it is NATO training the troops, that they are citizens of NATO countries in Ukraine fighting, and they are fighting against NATO armaments. At which point do we actually just say we are at war with Russia? I think it's fair to say that the U.S. is involved, providing intelligence to Ukraine so that they can sink Russian ships with NATO military weapons. And that's a little bit on the nose. Well, I don't know exactly if the weapons they used to sink these ships came from NATO. They were using, I think they're called, Neptune missiles? I could be wrong about that. But there's also another report that another Russian ship may have been struck by a missile and may be sinking. Russia initially denied reports that it was a missile that struck their ship and said it was a fire. But now we have more news. Sabotage wreaking havoc across Russia. Chemical plants, weapons facilities, recruitment facilities being attacked or mysteriously burning down. Could it be that we are actively engaged in a cross-border war that is no longer just Russia who has invaded Ukraine? Could it be that these stories over at NBC News are leaked on purpose to try and force the U.S. to engage in Ukraine? The American people are not willing to engage in war in Ukraine. Certainly, we don't want our soldiers on the ground, but there are already U.S. citizens fighting there. There are already citizens of NATO fighting there. It seems like this is a sneaky fourth or fifth generational way to engage in full-scale warfare with an adversary of the U.S. while claiming it's not really happening. Meanwhile, in the U.S., there have been several stories about food plants starting on fire or having fires in them. Of course, when you look at the mainstream press, they say it's a conspiracy theory among the right that there are food processing plant fires. There's also stories about chickens getting a chicken flu and having to be culled. Now, I don't know exactly why this is happening, but if you go to Google and you search, you'll find a ton of stories about all of these different food processing plants starting on fire. It may just be that fires happen, and because of the conflict, people have started to notice. That's why I'm not a big fan of chasing after the story as if there's something nefarious going on. But I do think it's worth highlighting, considering when Russia is hit by chemical facilities bursting into flames, media outright calls it sabotage. When in the U.S., there are a handful of stories about fires and plane crashes, the media says the right believes a conspiracy theory to cause food shortages is affecting the U.S., and it's all fake news. Well, I'm certainly not saying someone's trying to start food shortages in the U.S. like a grand conspiracy, but I would entertain the possibility that we are at war with not just Russia, many adversaries. It is escalating through hot conflict. And do you think that if the U.S. is providing intelligence, weapons, and manpower indirectly to the war in Ukraine and the Russian flagship was sunk, that Russia's going to be like, we won't do anything in retaliation? Or is it at least possible and important to talk about our critical infrastructure and what's called industrial control system vulnerabilities? That is to say, cyber warfare is very real. Is it possible that Russia is engaging in cyber war, or their allies are, against the U.S., and it's causing fires? Entirely possible. Is there evidence to suggest it? No, none whatsoever. So I will say, in the absence of evidence, the solution that makes the least amount of assumptions tends to be correct. And fires happen. But I do think it's worth talking about just because of what the after effects of it is going to be. Certainly, you can make assumptions about whether or not these fires at food processing plants and warehouses and distribution centers, you can talk about whether or not you think it's warfare or a conspiracy. The most important factor here is, as we're learning that there is going to be a food shortage due to this war, we should pay attention to the destruction at our food distribution and processing centers, because that will exacerbate the problem. But let's get started with, is the U.S. going to war with Russia? Apparently, we're already there. Before we get started, head over to timcast.com. And in the top right side, you will see sign up. Click that button to become a member. at Timcast to support our journalists. We're not perfect, but we try very hard. Our reporters are working every day, and we're hiring more. We just brought a new columnist I'll be excited to announce shortly, because we're going to be bringing you opinion analysis and fact-based reporting. We're also going to be hiring an independent fact checker who will work outside of our newsroom to call out any of our articles that would be fake news and even check framing. If an article appears to be biased based on how it's framed, we're going to be doing all of that. With your support as members, we are able to bring on these key players to help make sure we're producing factual and sound news to help you make decisions in your life. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive segments on the Timcast IRL podcast Monday through Thursday at 8 p.m. And you're going to assist in our culture jamming marketing strategy. Probably going to do one campaign per month. We got a little taste of it with that Times Square billboard we bought, but more is coming. And we're going to start slow and we're going to ramp things up. We are going to let the elites in the establishment know that with your support, they're not the elites anymore. That we are able to muster up power, to speak out and usurp the throne. Thank you so much for everybody who's supporting us as we continue in this mission. Let's read the first story from NBC News. U.S. intel helped Ukraine sink Russian flagship, Moskva, officials say. The flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet sank on April 14th after being struck by 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles, according to U.S. officials. Intelligence shared by the U.S. helped Ukraine sink the Russian cruiser Moskva, U.S. officials told NBC News, confirming an American role in perhaps the most embarrassing blow to Vladimir Putin's troubled invasion of Ukraine. Let's just stop for a minute there. NBC News saying the U.S. played a role in sinking Vladimir Putin's Black Sea flagship. One of the core reasons for this war is the warm water port in Crimea, Russia's access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And this was their flagship. And the U.S. gave the intel to Ukraine that allowed them to sink it, or at the very least played a role by providing the intel. Come on. You think Russia's sitting back going, we're not at war? Now, I think there's an attempt on both sides of this conflict to play down what's really happening out of fear it will get out of hand too fast. But Russia has absolutely entertained the possibility of nuclear retaliation, giving us a warning only in the past few days. We got Sweden and Finland saying they're going to join NATO, Russia saying, don't you do it or we'll go to war. And the threat of using nukes, and we're just carrying along as we inch toward some kind of serious escalation. NBC goes on, a guided missile cruiser carrying a crew of 510. The Moskva was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. It sank on April 14th after being struck by 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles. U.S. officials said Moscow said the vessel sank after a fire. The Moskva was the largest Russian warship sunk in combat since World War II. American officials said there were significant Russian casualties, but they don't know how many. The attack happened after Ukrainian forces asked the Americans about a ship sailing in the Black Sea south of Odessa. U.S. officials told NBC News. The U.S. identified it as the Moskva and helped confirm its location, after which the Ukrainians targeted the ship. You mean to tell me, huh? You're going to come to me and say, the U.S. said, hey, you see that boat? That's the Russian flagship. And Ukraine went, okay, beep. And the U.S. went, oh no, we didn't even realize Ukraine was at war with Russia and would sink their flagship. Come on. The U.S. did not know in advance that Ukraine was going to target the Moskva, officials said. Spare me! Are you kidding? And was not involved in the decision to strike. Maritime intelligence is shared with Ukraine to help it defend against attack from Russian ships, official added. So we're providing intelligence to Ukraine, weapons, and inadvertently personnel, but we're not intending for them to use it in an offensive capability. Okay, slow down. Russia's in the wrong for invading Ukraine. That's easy. The U.S. engages in soft power tactics. I think it's kind of dirty. I prefer the U.S. mind its own business. But in the game of geopolitics and international conflict, the U.S. going in and offering up money in exchange for favors is substantially more preferable. If that's all we had was like Game of Thrones style politicking and no war, we'd be much better off. Russia engaging in actual overt warfare just means they lost the actual political game. Not a fan of the hot conflict. It's destroying everything. It's sad, really. The U.S. role in the sinking has not been previously reported, but NBC News detailed last month how American intelligence shared with Ukraine had been instrumental in Ukraine's successes to date, including in helping Ukraine target Russian forces and avoid Russian attacks. American officials have expressed concerns that reporting about U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine could anger Putin and provoke an unpredictable response. Here we go, baby. The U.S. wants in. We want in that war. But we got to be careful. The Gulf of Tonkin, you remember this? When the U.S. staged a false flag. It was a false flag story. Oh no, we've been attacked, so that we could enter the war in Vietnam. The U.S. can't do that necessarily. They got to play it different. So here's what seems to be the strategy. Poke the bear until the bear strikes back. Then once Russia retaliates in any way against any NATO country, the U.S. could go, well, now we have to invade. Now we have to go to war in Ukraine, put boots on the ground. In a statement released after the story was published, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby said the U.S. did not provide Ukraine with specific targeting information for the Moskva. We were not involved in the Ukrainians' decision to strike the ship or in the operation they carried out. We had no prior knowledge of Ukraine's intent to target the ship. The Ukrainians have their own intelligence capabilities to track and target Russian naval vessels, as they did in this case. Okay, all right, let's slow down. Maybe it's just lies. The media is lying, desperate to get us involved in this war. So I want to be very careful. I think, however, the U.S. absolutely is taking actions to involve us in the war. I think we're already involved in the war, and I don't think it ends here. Is it a world war? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Russia is a regional power. I mean, they're massive, so they dominate a large swath of the planet. I believe that Russia has more landmass than Pluto. But it's not the landmass isn't what matters. It has access to resources, but it's a cold place in many ways. So we'll see. But Russia is powerful nonetheless, and this conflict could drag in China. China's already made moves to shore up its financial defenses in the event of Western sanctions, which has many people worried they're planning on moving on Taiwan. Now, following the news about the Moskva, we have this story. Has Ukraine blasted another Russian warship? MP says frigate is in trouble in the Black Sea and suggests it has been hit with a missile. Interesting. Oleksiy Goncharenko, head of the Council of Odessa, which houses Ukraine's largest naval base, identified the vessel on his Telegram channel as the Admiral Makarov. He said the vessel ran into difficulties overnight before reposting a report from a local news outlet suggesting it had been shot with Ukrainian missile near Snake Island, whose defenders memorably told another warship to go F themselves before they were captured and then released. That's my understanding. It's been a while since I read that story, so fact check me on that one. Unconfirmed reports suggest rescue vessels and aircraft have set off from Russia's largest Black Sea port in Sevastopol toward the site, while flight tracking data shows an American drone is circling nearby. If confirmed, it would be another hugely embarrassing loss for Russia after Ukraine managed to sink the Moskva, their flagship. I would just like to take an aside here and point out the new movie Top Gun Maverick, which is about a bunch of fighter pilots, which there are, but I just think it's funny because like everything's drones these days. They got to do Top Gun 3 and it's just like a guy sitting in a room and he's kind of like, he's got a big beer belly and he's eating chips and he's piloting a drone via remote control. I'm kidding. I know that's not what it's like, but you get the point. All right. So what's Vladimir Putin's response? What does he think about all this? Do you think old Vladdy is sitting back like, I don't care that this is happening? Putin to send doomsday warning to West at Russia's World War II victory parade. A doomsday warning. Could nuclear war be headed our way? Do you think Russia, as I stated, is just sitting back like, oh, the West isn't doing anything? Yo, I'm pretty sure Vladimir Putin is like, put the missiles on high alert. I mean, he already did that. He already put his nuclear forces on high alert. We better tread carefully here. President Vladimir Putin will send a doomsday warning to the West when he leads celebrations on Monday marking the 77th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany, brandishing Russia's vast firepower while its forces fight on in Ukraine. Defiant in the face of deep Western isolation since he ordered the invasion of Russia's neighbor, Putin will speak on Red Square before a parade of troops, tanks, rockets, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Interesting. A flypast over St. Basil's Cathedral will include supersonic fighters, Tu-160 strategic bombers, and for the first time since 2010, the Il-80 Doomsday Command Plane, which would carry Russia's top brass in the event of a nuclear war, the defense ministry said. In that scenario, the Il-80, or the IL-80, is designed to become the roaming command center for the Russian president. It is packed with technology, but specific details are Russian state secrets. The 69-year-old Kremlin leader has repeatedly likened the war in Ukraine to the challenge the Soviet Union faced when Adolf Hitler's Nazis invaded in 1941. The attempt to appease the aggressor on the eve of the Great Patriotic War turned out to be a mistake that cost our people dearly, Putin said on February 24th, when he announced what he called a special military operation in Ukraine. We will not make such a mistake a second time. We have no right. And that's important. How is Russia framing this conflict? You heard it right there. Vladimir Putin is likening what's happening to appeasing Hitler and then waiting for Hitler to invade. And this is omitted from much of the standard mainstream context over the war. They say Putin is he's Hitler trying to steal land. Not so simple. Ukraine going to NATO or the EU would be an expanse that Vladimir Putin is not willing to tolerate. I believe invading was wrong, but his argument is if we sit back, they'll invade us. Welcome to war, man. This is why I oppose it, because it's just getting to the point where everyone just starts attacking. And then there's destruction. And we see these beautiful cities of Ukraine start to crumble. And it is sad to see. Putin cast the war in Ukraine as a battle to protect Russian speakers there from persecution by Nazis and to guard against what he terms the U.S. threat to Russia posed by NATO enlargement. Ukraine and the West dismiss the fascism claim as nonsense and say Putin is waging an unprovoked war of aggression. Well, whether or not you want to have the opinion of the United States government or the Russian government, look, the point is the U.S. was playing soft power games. Joe Biden is a criminal, and that contributed to this. I think we could have avoided all of this if we just brought in Donald Trump. That NATO would have had its defenses shored up. Russia would not have invaded. Because the question is simple. Why did Russia wait until after Donald Trump got out of office to invade? Why did he not invade during Trump's presidency? Two reasons. Vladimir Putin feared Trump at least a little bit. And Trump was doing right internationally. He was getting rid of ISIS. He was stabilizing the Middle East. Not completely. I'm not saying every problem, but the Abraham Accords, many people say thanks to Jared Kushner, were great. There were great things happening under Trump. The world was healing. So why would Vladimir Putin invade when good things were happening? Now, how does the left and the establishment of the U.S. frame it? Trump was appeasing Vladimir Putin. Okay, let's play that game. You mean to tell me that crushing ISIS, stopping war in Syria, was Trump playing to Putin's agenda? Ending war. So what do you recommend? Are you saying that we should engage in endless conflict because Russia doesn't like it? But I like the idea that Trump was stopping the war. I like the idea that Russia also didn't want war. It's Russia's agenda to not want war. I don't want war either. This is what we get. They go on to mention a bunch of historical context about the war in 1812, the 1812 defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte and the Soviet Union losing 27 million people in World War II. We get it. They go on to mention that Russia's invasion has killed thousands of people and displaced nearly 10 million. It's an interesting argument. The idea from Russia that they waited when Hitler was attacking other countries and said, we'll just appease him. And then he invaded Russia and then Russia had to fight back. And so Putin's like, we're not going to do that again. Yeah, I call shenanigans. Build up your forces, fine. Build up your forces. But if you lose the soft power battle, you lose the soft power battle. I suppose the reality is it is dominoes falling over. What would Russia do? Do you think that Russia is going to be like, guess we'll lose? Nope. Nah, they're going to ignite the nukes. I do believe that Russia could use small yield strategic nuclear missiles, maybe a 100 kiloton bomb on Ukraine, and they would end this war overnight. But the diplomatic damage would be irreparable. At least in the short term. It would take a very long time to recover from using a nuclear weapon on Ukraine. But if Vladimir Putin really wanted to end this war, he could strike with small yield nuclear devices or tactical nuclear devices like nuclear artillery, which is a relatively high yield for what they are. So when the media says the war is not going good for Russia, it's because Russia is holding back. And if Russia really doesn't want to lose, you'll know it. Sweden says the U.S. has offered security guarantees if it applies to join NATO. Interesting. We have this story from the Moscow Times. Russia violates Finnish airspace as Helsinki molds NATO. Sweden and Finland have discussed joining NATO. Russia has warned them not to. Finland ramps up military exercises in case Russia threatens war. I mean, look at this. Russia violates Finnish airspace. They did it to Sweden. Saber rattling. Russia warns of nuclear hypersonic deployment if Sweden and Finland join NATO. April 14th. The day we learned of the Moskva sinking, or the day it happened. From Newsweek. Russian ambassador to U.S. says NATO not taking nuclear war threat seriously. I don't believe in mutually assured destruction. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Now, hold on. A lot of people said, Tim, you're wrong. It's a true thing. It's a doctrine. No. It's speculation, but that's what it basically is. The fear. The fear of mutually assured destruction is what makes mutually assured destruction exist. But if at any moment someone calls the bluff and fires a strike, and then there is no retaliation, the idea of mutually assured destruction is done. I do not believe that we will see nuclear missiles flying through the sky like in the movie War Games, crossing over, or like in G.I. Joe, whichever movie you like. I don't think so. I think Russia is telling the U.S. and telling NATO, we're going to nuke you. We're going to nuke your forces. There's literally no reason for Russia to nuke New York City or D.C. That makes no sense. And that's why I've never been a fan of the idea of mutually assured destruction. It always sounds strange. Why would Russia nuke New York? Seriously, give me an answer. And don't give me a one-dimensional comic book villain answer, because Putin is evil. Yeah. Some have said, if Russia was going to lose, they would say, fine, we'll strike your urban center. Why would they do that? If Russia was being attacked, they would not nuke the U.S. They would nuke the battlefront. They would target the military because they want to live. Imagine it this way. You're in a boxing match, right? And it's all or nothing. You better win or else you're in trouble. And so when the guy you're fighting is about to win, you go, guess I'll punch that lady right there. Why would you do that? It's not helping you in any way. You're like, well, I'm going to lose. I know I'm going to lose. Might as well punch that random woman. Okay, I guess technically there's the argument that the bad guy, knowing they're losing, aims their weapon towards a civilian saying, I will hurt someone innocent unless you back off. Perhaps. But I think if the bad guy was holding a weapon that they were able to aim, they would just aim it at the person who is threatening them. That is to say, if it ever got to the point where Russia was seriously threatened, they would use nukes in and around where they are being attacked from. If the fight is in Ukraine and NATO forces are moving through Ukraine or even Belarus, Russia's going to be like, fire the missiles in Ukraine where the military buildup is. And they would probably use it to create some kind of perimeter or barrier by taking out strategic points along the way, making it very difficult for ground forces to advance on Russia. Not to mention, Russia is so massive. Now, there's pros and cons to this. You got Vladivostok, which is in the far east, only like, I think, 50 miles from Japan. Crazy, right? And then you got the west, where it's like at St. Petersburg, and I think that's super close to Finland. Massive country. You can take out key structures, but they can always safely go and shore up half a world away. Which means it'll be harder to take out the nucleus, but it will be easier to spread thin. Interesting predicament. I don't think we really understand what nuclear war will look like. We have ideas, but it's never happened. I mean, the U.S. has dropped gravity bombs on Japan. Bombers come by and... But what we haven't seen is the use of intercontinental ballistic missiles at full-scale war. We don't know what it will look like. We don't know what weapons and capabilities have been created since then. It has been, 60 or so years? 60 or so years since the deployment, a little bit less, of these nuclear bombs. You think the U.S. has developed nothing else? How much you want to bet we have high-powered lasers for taking out missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles at high altitude? I bet we have satellites that have these capabilities. We had something called the Strategic Defense Initiative a long time ago. The idea was to find a way to take out nuclear missiles if they were coming our way. Perhaps like an Iron Dome defense system. Do you think there's no Iron Dome defense system? Okay, look, the Iron Dome in Israel, it fires missiles at missiles and takes them out in midair. It's not perfect. There's the THAAD system, which is thermo something, I don't know. South Korea has THAAD, THAAD, which is missile interception from North Korea to South Korea. Do you think the U.S. did not build any missile interception systems at all? I don't think we know what nuclear war would really look like. And I think there's a possibility that Russia will not use nukes because the moment they do, and the West reveals its capabilities in preventing, stopping, or defending against nuclear weapons, Russia loses everything. Their morale would collapse. So the question is, if Russia was losing, why won't they deploy a small-yield nuclear bomb in Ukraine? For one, I don't think they want to kill civilians. Two, they're not completely defeated, but things are going bad because they're going up against NATO. And three, maybe they know NATO's got ways of intercepting these things, and it would just reveal you're not nearly as powerful as you claim to be. But I don't know. It's entirely possible that we've developed to the point where there is no real defense. Right? I think about the comic book Watchmen, the graphic novel, where Dr. Manhattan, who is a superhero, says, if they fire all of their missiles and I stopped 99%, it only takes a few to get through. And that's the reality. If Russia fired off every single nuke they had in every possible way, we couldn't possibly stop it. You know, weapons. It used to be back in the day, you had a sword, right? We made chainmail armor that protected you from slashes. And all of a sudden, like, the swords were less effective. You had to figure out how to bypass the armor. Bows and arrows. And these can pretty much penetrate plate and mail armor. But still harder. So we found ways to break through the armor. Armor used to be fairly comparable. I mean, if you were wearing plate, it was hard to stab or slash you. You'd basically do blunt force damage with your sword. Granted, plate was not perfect. Plate armor, like, you know, old school armor, like medieval armor. You could still break through it. There were weak spots. And the other interesting thing is I don't think people realize that it was actually not that heavy. You know, it is heavy, but you could move fairly well in full plate armor. But eventually, we developed gunpowder. I mean, the Asians had it for a while. But with the rise of muskets, it didn't seem to make sense to wear that armor that would be ripped through by a musket ball, cannon fire, and other siege weapons. Instead, we said, why spend so much time and energy on these systems when we should just put it all into offense? And perhaps that's where we are. A good defense is a strong offense, right? Well, there's a major advantage in being the attacker. And that's what we have. I don't want to spend, I got to spend a little bit more time going into what's happening with the famine. Because I know I mentioned it early on. Ukraine's wheat harvest may fall by 35%, satellite images suggest. And this is where we're at. We have the fake news website, The Daily Beast. The Daily Beast is literally a fake news website, as NewsGuard shows right here. They say, proceed with caution. It fails to adhere to journalistic standards. Oof. Daily Beast, you're fake news. The right's new conspiracy theory, kamikaze planes and food fires. A bizarre right-wing conspiracy theory has found a prominent ally. And I'm going to mention that Tucker Carlson brought up that something strange is happening where there's a bunch of fires at food plants. That's it. And then they call him a conspiracy theorist. Full disclosure, timcast.com published a terrible article about the food plant fires, and I was unhappy with it. I said it was sloppy journalism, it was terrible work, and it needed several corrections. I still think we've issued the corrections, but I still think it should be taken down, and so we'll probably end up taking it down. But we got fact-checked by Snopes, of all people, and Snopes was right. Our article was bad. But our article wasn't asserting any conspiracy theories. It was simply pointing out that there were fires. The mistake we made was that our journalist included a 3-year-old story, 2.5-year-old story, as if it was recent. So there has been news about food plant fires. You need only go to Google. Here we go. So I searched for food plant fires minus conspiracy and minus arrested. Because for some reason, when you search for food plant fires, The conspiracy theory story, I understand why that's the big one. It's politics. But I don't care about the arguments about conspiracies. I don't care about conspiracies. And arrested, it was because someone got arrested involved with something unrelated to the fires. So I said, let's just show me food processing plant fires. 1 day ago, Purdue Farms. 3 weeks ago, Salinas. 5 days ago, Purdue. So Purdue Farms, same story, Chesapeake. I believe that these are the same stories. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is not. These are different. Purdue. Okay, well, that's weird. There's Cedar Rapids. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the first story is Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The second story is Salinas. Then Purdue Farms, Chesapeake. Then the story is just mentioning Cedar Rapids. Tyson says a plant was destroyed. There's poultry issues. Then you've got Suffolk Fire and Rescue, a Suffolk plant fire at a Hormel factory. Food processing plant at General Mills in Georgia. That story is repeated. Then the Salinas story. So some of these are repeats, but you have many of these stories. Fire at a California food plant. This is just right now. Okay. I don't play conspiracy games. I don't care for that. I thought the story was interesting because the real issue is that we're going to have food shortages. Take a look at this from Vox. Horrific bird flu that has wiped out 36 million chickens and turkeys explained. I'm hearing reports that people are told they need to cull their chicken populations because of this bird flu, because they're trying to shut it down right away. The idea being if we cull the latest crop of chickens, we end the bird flu in its tracks, and then we can reboot and start up. But we're already dealing with food shortages. So I can't tell you. There's some kind of conspiracy. I can only say that when we get news about Russians facing sabotage, arms manufacturers, chemical plants, and military enlistment offices, being destroyed. Now, I can understand the military stuff, but the chemical plants? Sabotage? The media wants to entertain that these fires and this destruction in Russia is sabotage. At least one instance, we saw people throwing Molotovs. We didn't see what started these fires. Couldn't these be sabotage? Could the U.S. not be facing similar conflict that Russia is? I don't know. In the absence of evidence, the solution that makes the least amount of assumptions tends to be correct. Occam's razor. In which case, fires happen. And my issue with the conspiracy theory, the war theory, is that we don't actually know if if fires at food plants happen with this frequency. So maybe 3 years ago, there's a whole bunch of fires at food plants. Fires happen, right? But nobody cares because there's no reason to care. Now, all of a sudden, someone notices, it sparks this idea. Everyone thinks there's some kind of crazy thing happening, but it's just normal. So what we've discovered so far is that it seems there is a serious uptick in food plant fires. There's a lot of ways to explain this. It could be that there's a labor shortage, so infrastructure is crumbling. That seems to be what makes the most sense. Okay, fine, whatever. I don't know. I can only tell you the war is going to get bad for everybody. And we're wrapped up in domestic issues, which I get because I think they're seriously important. But for the time being, it looks like the U.S. has involved itself directly by aiding in the sinking of a flagship. There's food shortages coming. I think we're getting involved in this war, ladies and gentlemen. I think we are involved. I'll leave it there. Next segment is coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimCastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all then.